Two up the first for today, November the 30th, 2022. I'm Ryan Ballingy. Thanks for being with us today. We're presented by our friends at French Lick Resort in French Lick, Indiana. We have two topics for you, as the name of the show implies. Sorry for no show yesterday. Kind of got everything out of whack earlier in the week and then wound up getting started on doing some renovations in my house. I'm working on renovating my laundry room. I know it's really exciting. And then kind of went down a rabbit hole of some things that we're going to talk about for today's show around the PGA Tour's 2020 tax return, what's called the Form 990. We'll explain that a little bit. And then some comments made by Tiger Woods ahead of the Hero World Challenge, kind of reiterating some of the things we've heard from Rory McIlroy in recent weeks about LIV and Greg Norman and some other stuff. So we'll talk about all of that, kind of weave it all together a little bit here and bring it together for you. So let's start with Tiger. Tiger's not playing in the Hero World Challenge this week. He withdrew from the tournament. He said he had plantar fasciitis in his right foot in preparing for the tournament. Says he can't walk. Says he can hit any shot that you want, but he can't walk. And from all of the kind of weird phone calls and comments that I've seen on the internet from people who have plantar fasciitis and have wanted to talk about it because they saw Tiger Woods at it, it sounds really awful and not very fun at all. So I can completely understand why he's not playing. He still intends to play in the match next week with Rory McIlroy to take on Jordan Spieth and Justin Thomas, but he's out and Sepp Straka is in instead. So Woods was talking about this week not only about being the host, but also kind of the future and the state of golf and his obviously very active role in all of that. And just to kind of square away what he wants to talk about in terms of maybe playing next year, he has made it very evident he is not going to return to becoming some kind of full-time player, just as anybody would have anticipated after the accident, the car crash that he, single vehicle car crash that he initiated after the Genesis Invitational a couple of years ago. But where he is with it right now in his leg, says he doesn't have a whole lot of left in his leg. He doesn't have a whole lot of really muscle development, gusto, whatever words you want to use, panache, I don't know, come up with whatever. But he doesn't have a whole lot of power in his leg, and it makes it very difficult to walk 72 holes. It makes it very difficult to be a legitimate professional golfer, particularly as a guy who spent his entire career built on power, for large portions of it at least. Even if it's mediocre power, it's still power. And so he said he's going to have a goal for next year to play in the 4 major championships. And he said maybe 1 or 2 others. So that could be maybe the Players, that could be maybe Genesis, and that's it. So if you see Tiger Woods 6 times next year, that's probably a pretty good result, all things together. He did play 9 competitive rounds this year. He's not going to play a competitive round this week. He's not going to play I would not consider the match a competitive round. It's an exhibition. And then you've got the PNC Championship, which, yes, he's playing golf, but he can also, if he wishes, ride in a cart, and he can also play in a scramble with his 13-year-old son. So I know they're competing, and I know they're trying to win, but that's not a competitive round either. So 9 competitive rounds the entire year, and each tournament got 1 fewer. Made the cut at the Masters, which is extraordinary unto itself. Completed the Masters in all 4 rounds. PGA Championship, again, made the cut, somewhat extraordinary unto itself, and then withdrew after the 3rd round, worst ever round in the PGA Championship, really, and not in great scoring conditions, not great weather, didn't feel great, got out. And then the Open Championship apparently may have had some form of disease, whether that was COVID, as Rory McIlroy said to the Irish Independent, or it was some other thing, I don't know, but apparently wasn't feeling all that great at St. Andrews, missed the cut after 2 rounds, and really has no intention of saying goodbye as that being his goodbye to St. Andrews. It sounds like he has every intention of trying to come back to St. Andrews one more time and that be it. So, that was a little encouraging, I suppose. But then we got on to topics of kind of political nature these days, namely LIV, and Woods reiterated the same thought that has seemingly become the talking point among PGA Tour players in recent weeks, I guess months, I don't know, weeks, but let's say, and that is that Greg Norman's got to go. Greg Norman has to go as the LIV Golf CEO before anything can happen. Any talks, any whatever can happen. He's got to go. And that the lawsuits, in Tiger Woods' words, have to be stayed, which basically means have to be withdrawn. And that lawsuit is now basically LIV Golf Inc. on behalf of the 11 players, mostly who have withdrawn from the suit as plaintiffs because now LIV Golf Inc. is involved. And I think Phil's still left and maybe Bryson's still left as the 2 players who are in it, if I remember right. Don't remember all of them, but I think it's down to 2. And basically Woods wants LIV to withdraw that suit, and those are the 2 preconditions to any meeting. And I think that's fair to say, hey, if you're involved in active litigation against somebody, it's probably not likely you're going to have a peaceful resolution through conversation, just saying. So that would make sense. But to call for Norman to be extricated as the CEO of LIV Golf, I don't know that necessarily changes anything, other than that for the players who have been dealing with LIV from the PGA Tour side, they see Norman as really the catalyst for this, and they want him to have to, I guess, suffer so that LIV can last in the long term. I don't know if that's a personal thing. It's kind of a vendetta to make him pay. If you love something, set it free. If you watch enough rom-coms to hear that line. But I don't know that it necessarily has anything to do with Norman being a key decision maker, or that he has a whole lot to do with the day-to-day operations of LIV. And there's actually some intrigue about that. We'll talk about it a little bit later in the show. But it seems like the intent is to kind of force Norman into some pain before LIV can have a conversation. And maybe that's because he's been a provocateur. Maybe that's because he's enacting a 30-year grudge, revenge on a 30-year grudge against the PGA Tour. Maybe it's because he spent so much time and someone else's money, the Saudis' money, in recruiting players and signing them and doing a lot of damage to the PGA Tour. I don't think you can really disagree with that at this point. So maybe that's what they're trying to extract. But it doesn't seem like there are other demands for there to at least be conversations with LIV about how to move forward in some version of coexistence. I think you would argue right now they are coexisting. LIV is existing by bringing in players with lots of money and paying them lots of money to play golf, whether that's on an advance or otherwise, per contract, whatever. And the PGA Tour is existing because they're throwing lots of money at top players through the FedEx Cup, through the Player Impact Program, through the Comcast Business Tour Top 10, through the elevated events. So, in a way, everyone is kind of winning right now. But what LIV wants, obviously, is some legitimacy through the official World Golf ranking for getting their players points and kind of trying to equate what you're seeing on LIV and what you're seeing on the PGA Tour. But I don't know if the PGA Tour has a whole lot of demands. I don't know if the players can make demands. So having this kind of vague sense of, for what reason would you be having a conversation? What could the PGA Tour extract from LIV, or the golf ecosystem more broadly could extract from LIV in exchange for really what it wants most, which is its players to be able to move back and forth between tours and world ranking points. The world ranking point thing, at this point, I'm not even sure really matters all that much, because at the end of the day, it only really applies to the major championships. It's now a marketing tool. So for the PGA Tour and the folks who are sitting on the board of the official World Golf ranking, they don't probably want to provide LIV with the marketing tool to say, hey, we've got the legitimate number 3 player in the world and a number 47 player in the world, number 22 player in the world. They probably don't want to do that. So any compromise there is not going to really be in favor of LIV. And they don't really have a whole lot to stand on LIV in trying to get points. Like, who cares? It doesn't matter, really, other than for a marketing purpose, because all the major championships can say, we don't need to use that standard anymore to invite players. We'll just change it. So it's not an access thing. That's not it. And the major championships haven't come out and said, hey, we're not going to give you access to these tournaments. In fact, quite to the contrary. The R&A has said, hey, if you qualified for the Open, you're in the Open. Same thing basically for the U.S. Open. If you qualify for the Open, you're in the Open. If you qualify for the Masters, and so far as we've heard, and of course that can change, you're in the Masters. So none of those entities have excluded players if they have qualified for those tournaments. So the OWGR is just a marketing tool at this point for LIV. Now, for an access standpoint, there's certainly something that has to kind of go on here. If there's going to be some kind of peace negotiation, whatever you want to call it, then what the PGA Tour you'd have to think they're trying to extract from LIV is you have to then give players from the PGA Tour access to LIV if LIV wants its players to have access to the PGA Tour, DP World Tour, etc. So the LIV is a closed system, right? It's a league. It's 48 players, and those 48 players compete every week for the 14 tournaments that they have. And no one comes in and no one comes out. That's the way they've set this up for next year. Now you have alternates for each team, so you could have 60 players under some kind of contract as fill-ins in the event of injury, but effectively you have 48 players. And there really is no way that as it's constructed, a PGA Tour player could say, hey, I'm willing to play LIV and the PGA Tour in a world where everyone is sunshine, lollipops, and rainbows. And LIV could say, okay, well, we've got a spot for you right here. Here it is, spot number 49. That doesn't exist. So for the PGA Tour to extract something from LIV, I don't know how you do that given their business model, given what they intend to do from a business perspective. If LIV is to open its doors and says, okay, well, we will have individual spots available through Monday qualifiers or open invitations or whatever, how they want to handle that, but you can't compete in the team portion, maybe that's something. Again, I'm just trying to imagine here. I'm not saying that this is going to happen. Just trying to imagine what the PGA Tour would want from LIV. And what LIV wants is obviously to be able to say to their players, you have your PGA Tour membership back. You can go play whatever events you want, but you have to play ours. And that would be the constraint for LIV players being contractually obligated to play all the LIV events, but you could go play the PGA Tour whatever number of times a year outside of the majors if you're qualified for them, outside of the LIV events that you're going to compete in. Obviously, that wouldn't mean a whole lot. That would maybe be anywhere from 2 to 6 events, I guess. But then the PGA Tour would probably say, yeah, you can play in the Wyndham Championship, just throw out a random tournament, but you sure as hell aren't going to compete in Memphis and the BMW and the Tour Championship. You can't qualify for that. You have to play in X number of events to do that. We don't care how many points you get. We're going to create a minimum number of events to be able to do that, or something like that for a LIV player. They're going to make it onerous. So I don't, again, trying to figure out what the negotiation is, I don't really see that there is one. And the only thing I can think of is that it comes down potentially to access to money. Could the PGA Tour go to the Saudis and say, well, we'll let you come on board under our umbrella if you invest banana stand money in the PGA Tour, the DP World Tour, and we're willing to play in that confine? Or the players that have been offered apparently enormous sums of money by LIV to sign could reap that benefit in some fashion, whatever that looks like. Again, very difficult to understand what one side would get from the other, particularly from the PGA Tour to LIV, unless it basically involved a lot of money coming back to the PGA Tour. And maybe that's exactly what they're going for, and it could be just that simple. But I don't really see what the point of, from the PGA Tour's perspective, what they're going to try to get from LIV. I totally get what LIV's perspective is, what they're trying to accomplish. So I'm not understanding it, not trying to be critical of it. I just don't understand, and maybe we'll get some illumination on that later. All right, second story for today, and this is admittedly a little bit behind, but there's been a lot of talk this year about the PGA Tour's non-profit status because it's a 501c6, and that means as a not-for-profit membership organization, there's some really intriguing stuff in the tax code and how they report and what they report and what their resources are and whether they should have that status. And a lot of people turn to what's called the Form 990 to try to be critical of the PGA Tour for some reason relative to LIV. I really don't understand the source of this entirely, but having spent a lot of time over the last 15 years looking at the PGA Tour's Form 990 tax returns, I'm kind of compelled at this point to be interested in it when they're available. And for a long time during the pandemic, the Tour's 2019 and 2020 Form 990s were not made available to the public, nor were a lot of those filings for not-for-profits. They have to make them filing as a United States organization under federal tax code. And then, under law, those filings have to be available for the public to consume so that they can evaluate them and understand what not-for-profits are doing, whether that's for charitable giving, whether that's for executive compensation, whatever it is, but that's allowed for public scrutiny. So the 2019 and 2020 filings, I've been looking at them really when this controversy started around LIV, and obviously that kind of became a talking point, primarily Jay Monahan's salary, but also the PGA Tour's not-for-profit status, because they wanted to sue the PGA Tour, and because they're not-for-profit, but not understanding they're a member-based organization, and there's that you can be one of the both. And yes, you can be critical of that as a point of fact, but in terms of law, member-driven organizations can kind of do what they want to set their membership policies and what their members can and cannot do in exchange for being a member. And so finally got hands on the 2020 Form 990 the other day, just looking through it, because there was a tweet, I think, from Kyle Porter, and this was actually during Tiger's news conference, where Tiger said, erroneously by the way, that the PGA Tour took out an enormous loan during the pandemic to bridge finances. And the PGA Tour later confirmed that's not true. That wasn't the case. Tiger misspoke. I don't understand the disconnect. I don't understand why Tiger said that or what he implied by that. I'll try to get back to that in a second. But that led me to think about, okay, well, let's see if the 2020 Form 990 is out. I guess it's been out for a little while. Last time I looked for it was over the summer. I haven't looked since. And I just finally found it. And there are a bunch of places you can look for it. If you're interested in looking at this kind of thing, if you are this big of a geek as I am, you can look for them on a website called GuideStar, or just search PGA Tour Inc. Form 990 2020. It'll pop up. You'll find it on Google. It's easy to find. It's a PDF. It's very long. It's a tax document. It says some things that are interesting, says some things that are really boring, and then in some places doesn't say anything at all. It doesn't really give you a whole lot of information. But it does kind of give you a good idea of the tour's finances, its obligations, its executive compensation, who it gives money to, many of the related entities under the PGA Tour Inc. umbrella, which is interesting because PGA Tour Inc. is a not-for-profit, tax-exempt organization, but they have for-profit subsidiaries. And back in the day, before I got into this line of work, I worked in public policy, and I worked for a very interesting company that was similarly set up, that was a not-for-profit parent company with a for-profit subsidiary that then used the for-profit funds to create grants and other money that went out the door from the not-for-profit portion of the company. And there are other not-for-profits underneath the not-for-profit. So really bizarre structure, very complicated to understand, which kind of makes it interesting to me to try to read the PGA Tour's Form 990s and see where they are and try to understand any scrutiny about them. But one of the big things that came out in Wall Street Journal kind of reporting around the PGA Tour, and they have been on this, and I think they have probably been fed by a source that's pro-LIV, but I don't have proof of that, but that Jay Monahan made $14 million last year, or in 2020 rather. And if you look at the filing, the PGA Tour pushed back in a comment to Golf Digest and said, no, he didn't make $14 million, he made, I think they said $8.3 million. And that also isn't entirely accurate. It's more like $9.3 million, somewhere in that range, $9.5 million. But what the intriguing conversation that I had yesterday was from a guy who hosts a podcast, LIV Golf, whatever. But the guy was saying, okay, well, Jay did make $14 million because of the third column in this tax return document, which is kind of money, deferred compensation, and other compensation is basically the three columns. And the other compensation column was something like $4 million. And so it added up to a little over 14. And he goes, well, of course, people who speak on the internet don't do so kindly. And so he called me Zippy for some reason. But anyhow, I had to explain to him how a tax document works and what constitutes salary and what constitutes compensation, which is considered benefit and is taxable. And those are different things. Now, you can play with the words deferred compensation, you can play with the word benefit compensation, you can play with all kinds of different terminologies, but cash in pocket and deferred compensation and benefit compensation are different things. So one of the big things for Jay Monahan is apparently that Monahan, and this is something the Wall Street Journal reported, that Monahan is required, I don't know if required is probably the right word, but I think that was the word they used, required to travel via private jet. And so that probably wasn't mean he's required to do it. It probably means he negotiated it into his contract. I don't know that one way or the other. That's semantics, but he travels by private jet. Let's just call it that. Either way, whether the PGA Tour makes him or he negotiated it. Either way. And as you may or may not know, private jet hours rack up very quickly. It's something like $30,000 an hour market rate. It could be higher, it could be lower, depending on the type of jet that you use. But if you've ever kind of researched that just on a whim, if you're trying to charter a plane to go to anything, if you were trying to get some PJs together and get 8 guys on a plane and go do a crazy trip, whatever. If you ever had that dream and looked it up, it's something like $30,000 an hour. And so if Jay Monahan is using that for personal travel, as it sounds like he did during at least portions of the pandemic, according to the Wall Street Journal reporting, all those pilot hours and plane hours add up very, very quickly. I'm not saying that that doesn't count as a benefit that he is taxed on because he is using PGA Tour corporate stuff for maybe personal activity because he's required to, but that's not cash in pocket. So it's something just interesting to understand about what you're reading in a tax document and what it tells you, because elsewhere in the document, you're looking at a compensation of like $9.3 million, and that's later on the document. One of the pages where they scan it, it's the sideways PDF pages, and you kind of have to turn your head and read it that way, or you can obviously change the orientation. Just kind of joking. I know a computer works. But it's one of those things where what you see on one page doesn't exactly match what you see on another page, and there's a reason for that. So I'm not saying that Jay Monahan incurred $4 million worth of private airjet time in 2020. I have no clue. But if he flew even 10 times, 15 times for personal purposes, whatever reason, and that's legs. That's not even trips. That's legs. So you got to fly 2 legs each way if you're coming home. And let's just say, apparently he has a place in Colorado Springs, somewhere in that area, per the Wall Street Journal. So let's say you're flying from Ponte Vedra to there. Let's call it 4-5 hours, something like that. I don't know the exact flying time. I don't care enough to look it up. But let's call it 5 hours just for interest's sake. At $30,000 an hour, that's $150,000 to fly out there on a private jet. It's $150,000 to fly back. That's $3 million. Or $300,000. If you do that 10 times, that's $3 million. Again, no idea how many times he flew personally under the PGA Tour's jet or jet program or whatever it is. No idea. But those hours rack up extremely quickly. And so you have to consider that when you're reading the filing. Do you call that compensation? Yes, it's taxable. Is that money in his pocket? No, that is a benefit. So it's similar to kind of a company car in a way. And it depends on how you classify that as well. But anyway, intriguing piece of it, all related to Monahan's compensation. And then the other part of it, which PGA Tour gets criticized for, mostly because of Phil Mickelson saying, oh, the tour has $800 million lying around that they're just sitting on, which, yes, that they should. Also, the USGA is sitting on like $700 million, so think of that what you will. But if you look at their balance sheet and you see what the PGA Tour has, they have a tremendous amount of investments. They have something like $2.5 billion worth of investments, in the mid-twos in investments. However, they also have $1.6 to $1.7 billion of pension obligation that they have racked up over the years. If you don't know the PGA Tour's pension program, you get money per cut made, and if you make 15 cuts, the money doubles. And then you get most of your FedEx Cup money, unless you win it or finish in like the top 3 or 5, goes into your retirement plan. And so there are thousands, probably a couple thousand people who draw pensions from the PGA Tour or will eventually. So there's a huge pension obligation there, and that increases over time, of course. That's not to say that the tour isn't flush with cash. They have a whole lot of money sitting around, and that's great for them, I guess. But that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with that. Is that money they should pay out to the players? Not necessarily. I mean, you can have a rainy day fund. You also have a pension ratio, a funding ratio to which your obligation is to the money that you have. That obviously would be well above what they have in terms of percentages. But they also have hundreds of millions of dollars available in, or not available, but in illiquid assets like the golf courses that they own and other properties that they own, things like that. So it's a very interesting read, and I highly encourage you to take a look at it. And if you want to try to parse it, I'm happy to try to answer any questions about it. I have to look stuff up from time to time, of course. But the one thing I did want to point out, the loans receivable for the PGA Tour, which is a very boring point. But loans receivable basically is when the PGA Tour probably went to a customer that owed them money, whatever that was, sponsor, what have you, and they owed them money and said they can't pay. And the PGA Tour said, okay, well, we will take a promissory note in exchange. You will eventually pay us back. What is that? That went up $240 million in 2020, which is a huge jump for them. Went from like 500-ish to 750-ish million dollars. That's a big, big deal. That's a lot of money. And that might be an indication of some pandemic-related stuff. And we'll look at 2021 eventually and see how all that works itself out. But lots of intrigue there for tax geeks or for nonprofit geeks or just geeks. I mean, it's kind of fun to check out, but worth your read if you care about those kinds of issues. All right, that's going to do it for us today on 2 Off the First. Sorry for running a little bit long today, but this is the kind of stuff I get into. It's time I spend personal hours reading for fun, which is, to say out loud, not great. But I hope you enjoyed the show. I hope you enjoyed the dive in on a couple of things. We will have probably a show tomorrow and probably not Friday. We'll switch that. I'm not sure exactly how that's going to work out, but we'll have one more show this week, and then we'll get back at it after the weekend. So hope you have a great rest of your day. We'll talk to you next time on 2 Off the First.